All right, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on automating user provisioning. My name is EJ Stanley, and I will be your presenter for today's session. At Fortra, I serve as a solutions engineer supporting our automation solutions, which include Automate. Also under our automation umbrella, we also provide workload automation via our JAMS product, and our IDP solution, which is Automate Intelligent Capture, helps our customers with data classification and data capture, typically unstructured documents. If you'd like to learn more about either of those offerings, please let us know. All right, looking at our agenda for today, we're going to cover why and how we should automate HR processes. We're going to spend some time talking about the challenges organizations see and the benefits of deploying an automation strategy. We're then going to have a quick demo with Automate Plus. So there we're going to see a mock-up of an example HR or user onboarding type workflow. And then we're going to show how we streamline that process using Automate Plus. And we'll try to save some time at the end of the call for questions and answers. And depending on which interface you might be using, putting a question in the chat can be a little bit different. If you're in the GoToWebinar browser interface, you'll see a section at the bottom that'll say enter a question for the staff. You'll simply just type in your question there or comment and hit send. If you're using the Instant Join app, you'll first navigate to the question mark with a circle around it, then type in your question, and then hit the blue send button at the bottom. All right, before we jump into our webinar content, just wanted to take a moment to really highlight the entire Fortra solution set in a quick overview. We're going to be spending a lot of time in the automation side of the house, but we also offer a full line of cybersecurity solutions to help your organization as well. So our infrastructure protection suite, which consists of our vulnerability management and offensive security solutions, really allow you to identify and prioritize vulnerabilities in your systems, which I think we see all too often these days. Understand which of those vulnerabilities may be exploitable, even conduct red team exercises to understand how an attacker could exploit those vulnerabilities and, more importantly, how the best way to respond to those. Our data security suite, which consists of our data loss prevention, digital risk protection, secure file transfer, and email security solutions, really allow you to identify that sensitive data so you can wrap the appropriate security controls around it without becoming a barrier to those legitimate business processes that you need to execute. Also allows you to ensure that when that data is being shared appropriately, it is being shared securely as well, and protect that sensitive data from external threats such as ransomware, spyware, and even phishing. Our threat research and intelligence offerings enhance our host of threat feeds through researching and augmenting our data collection. Additionally, they leverage our Threat Fusion Center data to find new threats that may have been missed by automated classifiers or operations analysts, because we know mistakes can get through, as well as investigate confirmed threats to analyze trends or even identify attackers. Now, our automation solution, again, which we'll be talking about some today, allows you to boost productivity, improve accuracy, help your organization grow by handling those repetitive manual workloads, and provide non-technical users with the means to automate tasks, while also allowing highly technical users to automate, those really complex business processes, slightly what we'll be looking at today, but also things like batch processing as well. All is a means to free up valuable IT resources, again, by automating those time-consuming tasks such as manual monitoring, optimization, and so on. And our centralized analytics solutions simplify product administration, centralize key metrics, provide mobile control, and our new Fortra One platform, it provides dashboards for security and operations data, really helping customers deploy our software. And many products today already have user interface accesses from here, and you can even do analytics from this panel as well. And with that, let's go ahead and get into our content for today. So, why would we want to automate HR processes? As we know, in many organizations, uh, HR processes, they can really be quite manual. It's usually because the processes are, dealing with disparate and non-integrated data sources, right? So it's manually filled in, sometimes even electronically filled in, but forms that are used, which can introduce transcription of data errors into these systems, and there may not be a single source of truth, which can complicate those processes even further. So, what HR processes can be automated? So, as we can see from this slide, we have both onboarding and offboarding examples shown. So, in our onboarding process, we see a common process of setting up users in Active Directory. This can be another authentication environment as well. The creation of user accounts in various applications, and then granting appropriate permissions that might be needed, and then updating the groups a user or users belong to in that authentication environment. And this could be part of the overall life cycle as well, the employee in your company. So as people are moving between different departments, different roles, for example. And then when it's time for offboarding, we're often reversing our actions that we performed in the onboarding exercise. So we're now removing users in Active Directory. We're deactivating accounts in those applications, particularly in situations where we have users in Active Directory, but we also maybe have user account information, stored within our specific applications. And then, of course, removing authorizations or removing permissions for users. And that can be simple as, if the user has access to a file system, for example, just changing permissions on those file systems to deny access, as an example. So here we see some of the most common HR processes to automate. Not an all-encompassing list, but just some common ones that we typically see. As we discussed in the previous slide, um, Active Directory and user provisioning, right? So in most organizations, this aspect of the HR process, particularly would benefit from some level of automation. We talked about a few of the common ways automation is applied or could be applied in this process, but that could also be taking data, from forms, maybe from a spreadsheet, for example, and then populating other data sources. So think of databases, GUIs, so UI front ends, for example. A key component here is to have some sort of normalization of the data to make this successful as an automation candidate, right? We need to be at that data formatted into a way that we can easily use it in other applications and other processes. So web browser automations here as well. So maybe in our company, some of our HR systems are accessible via a web browser. In a lot of cases, there's no integration between our authorization environment and a sub office, or think of a main office. And this is something we've actually worked with previous customers here at Fortra. One example, the offices of that company were split across different countries, and the sub, or think of the satellite offices, they maintained their own instances of Active Directory. And so there was no trust really between the two environments. So that sub office, was really left to do this manual transcription process, right? Automation allowed them to open the HR system via a web UI, take that user information from their local environment, and perform the keying in of that data into the interface. Typing the characters, pressing the submit button, waiting a couple seconds, and then repeating those same steps for the next user in line. And this was an extremely impactful manual process for that company. And they were dealing with several hundred users on a routine basis, which isn't an uncommon story in a lot of organizations. Next, we have an image-based OCR, right? In most organizations, a certain amount of data is entered into various forms. So, think about traditional onboarding forms, like legal and tax forms, role-specific documents, emergency contacts, things along those lines. And it's not always online data that we're dealing with. So we need to have a means to capture, that data. Um, think about PDFs and other types of forms that we might be dealing with. And then, of course, we have items like, data extraction, transformation, and entry automation. So you really can think of this like an ETL process, right? Where we're capturing or extracting data, we're manipulating it into a suitable format so they can be entered into, let's say one of our HR systems. You could consider this as a data normalization exercise. We talked about the importance of that a moment ago, but really the takeaway is to be able to take disparate data and then get it into a standardized format that we can use. And finally, listed here is application integration. So, our users need to be given access to the applications that they use in their roles so they can perform their day-to-day work. And if those applications don't have pre-built integrations, into Active Directory, for example, then that could result in a manual exercise of having to extract and enter information into our application, those configuration into our applications, to allow that user access. So these are areas, that can be prime candidates for automation in our HR process. All right, so now let's look at the process an organization might go through. And this is a high level view here. So we're not focusing on really any specific application or technology in this view. When we set out to implement automation, it's always a great idea, to map out the steps that are currently involved in our process, and we kind of try to visually show that here. So here we can see in the before section, there are quite a number of steps with a number of them being manual. We've got email notifications going out to our managers, to make them aware new employees officially starting. The manager emails the support team to advise, we need a new account created for this user. And then that kicks off a process to perhaps, create a help desk ticket or multiple help desk tickets, depending on the work that needs to be performed. Our help desk ticketing system, it may already have some automation here to make our support team aware of work that needs to be completed, and then all the way until we send out a confirmation back to the manager, to let them know the work was completed. So looking at this, we can start identifying a lot of potential failure points. Emails may get missed. Managers get upset, right? Or users are delayed getting access to systems, which can stop work. Transcription errors lead to invalid accounts being created, which then may lead to permissions being signed incorrectly to users. Or users could incorrectly get added to production systems when maybe they only need to be have access rather to development systems. Our before scenario, which is quite common to see, it's driven by emails, custom spreadsheets. It can lead to ambiguity and confusion. And what we really want to do is eliminate as much of those manual and error-prone steps, to simplify and streamline our processes. And that is represented here on our after view, or our happy state, as we might refer to it. And using a solution like Automate Plus, it allows us to accomplish these tasks with relative ease. And the benefits are numerous. A reduction in time to complete, increased accuracy, and we can build an audit trail of what's being performed along the way. All right, so let's dig in a little further to the process that most organizations would go through from hiring our new employee to the retire or offboarding stage. So our entire employee life cycle. There are large amounts of data that accumulates over the life cycle, and the HR group has to manage applications and associated documents for employment. It's often not as simple as it seems on the surface. Just fill out a form and you get a new employee, right? And as a new employee, you're probably going to receive a lot of data. Some system contain forms, some through email, things like policies and handbooks, and all that data needs to be managed by someone. And the hiring team and the HR system, they need to support all that data as well. Then as we move down the life cycle, past the first few days, we have more paperwork documents that need to be maintained for an employee, such as reviews, status changes, pay rate changes. And then at some point, our employee time will come to an end with the company. Maybe it's retirement and they'll retire happily, or maybe they're moving on to another great opportunity, but more paperwork and data associated with that process as well. So let's next take a look at the application process. And what we're trying to do here is paint a picture of how we can start automating these processes. You may have a standard application process, depending on what your organization does and how it operates. For example, you may have a single form or document that you want prospective applicants to fill in. Provide you with their basic information and background, and then we take this information and bring it into our automated processes to make it a lot easier to bring employees on board. So looking at some of the aspects of the first day, that may need to be addressed. And keep in mind here that this is representative of an environment without full automation or total automation being in place today. Depending on the role and the size of the company, the employee might expect, a PC, being able to log in for the very first time, having access to email. So these are examples of all the things that need to be set up and managed for a particular user. And if we move forward, there are going to be ongoing processes that are involved with HR, throughout the employee lifecycle. So we've got, more form updates, things like employee reviews, training, what certification have our employees completed? Are we performing any, competency testing on our employees to make sure they're in the right role within the company, etc. And then, of course, on the last day, we have to deal with tasks like returning issued equipment. So, PCs, office badges, exit interviews, and all this information needs to be documented and recorded as well, so that we know we've actually performed those tasks. And some of these processes, are always going to be manual. Like someone physically handing in door keys or an ID badge, right? So some things are physical, which cannot be automated, but we can certainly work towards making the process more efficient by implementing automation, wherever possible. So this brings us to the heart of the discussion, right? How are we going to automate our HR processes? So, let's further outline kind of the various aspects that can make that could be automated rather using Automate Plus. And we'll see some of this in the demo portion later on. But to speak to this, we can take some of this information, and really build a workflow where we can gather, evaluate, and execute parts of our previously manual process. So one key process we might want to start with is querying our authorization environment, which might be Active Directory, could be something else, and then getting that user information out of those systems to work with. These are some of the examples of the information we can gather, and this data will be useful to us throughout the process. So, being able to query and report on inactive users, users that have logged in or inactive over a certain time period, disabled users, failed login attempts, right? We can report on all this information and make that extremely valuable. So some additional potential automated processes that take place for onboarding new users can be seen here. And a lot of these are input-output type events. A daily news user feed, for example. This might be coming in from emails from management teams. It's a feed that is coming into our environment, telling us there are new employees that are joining our company. Websites and FTP files. So this could be an extraction process. Maybe that's already in place, and we're taking that data from an existing HR system and feeding it into our automated process. The key thing here is that we want these inputs to trigger user creation. And by triggering user creation, it covers the following steps where we want to create the user. We want to set those AD attributes. We need to set up information in AD so that other people can then start using those in queries, right? And this information becomes very important, especially if you're in regulated environments. You need to know for a particular employee, who's their manager, what department are they in, because that can be used to determine what applications they actually really should have access to. And tight access controls are extremely important, as we mentioned, especially in regulated environments, maybe using financial services as one example. So the next part of the process then is integration of users from that single source of truth. And so our single source of truth is either typically going to be an HR system or our consolidated data that we've normalized. And then we're going to put that information into, let's say corporate applications that we want our users to use, right? So we've received information from the HR system, which feeds into account creation with Active Directory. And then in turn, we can use Active Directory information to interact with enterprise applications, potentially, or we might integrate with those directly, depending on the application. We might not have a programmatic rather way to interface into those systems, but we can still automate those processes either using Windows application interaction or website integration, via browser. And Automate makes it extremely easy to do that with our web browser and recorder capabilities. And then, of course, for the applications, that do support that programmatic interaction, we can then use Automate to interact with the application through a service. Maybe it's an API request, for example. Maybe it's our native actions for Active Directory. We're going to be building a workflow, really effectively that's going to be taking that flow from an HR system into Active Directory and then entering in or uploading information into those needed applications to complete, that integration process. Now, one area that can potentially be overlooked as an automation candidate in an organization is the ongoing auditing of users. Particularly in companies with very strict regulations in place. These organizations are often bound by SOC or ISO compliances, and this can be an intensive manual task that gets performed on a regular basis. And the steps laid out here are kind of representative examples of what a company might have to go through, say on a quarterly basis, for example. So we're probably extracting user records from multiple authentication and authorization sources. Then we might need to generate a list of applications and folders or directories that those users have access to. Maybe this is partially automated already today, or maybe it isn't, right? But we want to try to get it that way. We want to be able to validate, filter, clean up our reports. So maybe in step one here, where we pull user data, we have that spreadsheet, for example. And then we take a subset of that data and create another spreadsheet or a cross-reference spreadsheet that is then sent to managers for some validation of that data. And we're saying we managed to find out all the applications for your department or unit. And this is a list of users, based on the best knowledge we have, that show that they have access to these applications. So Mr. Manager, Mrs. Manager, can you please confirm and respond that this is accurate, or note needed changes. So now we go into this kind of waiting process, and this is typically done, via email, waiting for our managers to respond to validate our data. So we're extracting a lot of data from a lot of applications. That can be a real pain to complete accurately. We have tons of manual steps along the way. So automation really can make this a much easier task. And because we can audit our automation, we can keep our auditors, happy as well. All right. With that, it's time for our demo portion of the webinar. And we're going to be looking at Automate Plus today in our demo environment. And in just a second, I'm going to pull up our workflow designer to get started. All right, here is our workflow designer. So what we want to demonstrate in this demo is really a potential outline or a suggestion of an HR process for onboarding user accounts. And we're going to see this via a workflow we have here using Automate Plus. The Automate Plus Workflow Designer, allows us to lay out our entire business process and connect individual processes together via flow control mechanisms. So, success paths, failure paths, evaluation, even logic like waiting for multiple processes to complete before we move forward in that process. So let's go ahead and just kind of recap or cover our workflow about everything that's going on here. So we got multiple individual tasks. These are representative here by these gray icons. And the very first process that we're going to do here is create essentially a shared data set. Now, data sets in Automate are nothing more than objects that we can store data into. And creating this data set in a structured way is going to help us with our data normalization exercise. So as we collect data, we're going to put it into a format that is normalized or we know about, it's static, and then we can more effectively use that data in our downstream processes. And in addition to data sets, even variables and arrays, we can create those at the workflow level, and then we can reference that data throughout additional processes in our workflow. So we can create a data set here. We're going to fill it with data in another step, and then we can reference it in all the downstream processes as well. So that's what a workflow designer allows us to do, is create very reusable, shareable data in our process. Now, another key activity in our workflow is going to be the second step here, which is going to be actually bringing in data from a remote source. And in this example, that's going to be an email or multiple emails that we're going to get some attachments in that contains that new employee data. Now, we could trigger this workflow multiple different ways. We're going to do it manually today during our demo, but there's multiple different things that we call conditions or events in Automate that allow us to trigger an automated workflow to start. So, we're getting our data source in this example via email. So we could have an email trigger setting here that we could drag in, monitoring that email inbox. New emails arrive. It's going to trigger our process to kick off, right? We could also have a schedule setting here. That way we could trigger things on a durational basis. Maybe we're checking every day for new employee emails. Maybe we're checking every 4 hours, right? So a cadence that we could look for. And we're not limited to a single condition. We could have both a schedule and an email trigger setting here. Maybe we also get some of our user forms in via a file system. So someone's manually dropping those in a network directory. So we could have multiple conditions kicking this off. We're just going to use a manually kick off today for this demonstration purposes though. And a couple of things to point out, we mentioned, the success paths and these evaluation paths, but there's also failure paths built in. So, here in our first example, we're creating this data set. What if we didn't do a cleanup exercise? And we tried to recreate a table a second time? That would cause a failure, right? So we actually have a failure path built in here. So this failure scenario is going to go to a completely different task, and it's going to look for that temp table to see if it exists. If it does, it's going to clean that up, and on success, it's going to go back to the very start of our task. So we can have some built-in logic to, perform survivable events to accommodate for, failures in our workflow as well. So as we look over the rest of the workflow, you should start seeing some of the basic similarities from what we saw, in the slide deck earlier. So, we are using those evaluation capabilities to make a determination on, do we have any spreadsheets that we need to process? Because again, that's one example of the way data can be received. Or do we have any PDF documents to process that have come from our email, as an attachment in this case? And in both scenarios, if that evaluation is false, we don't have a valid file to process, we're just sending out a notification back via email, in our false path. Maybe someone wants to be notified the number of attempts that we get or user accounts that we get or why we didn't receive something that maybe we expected, right? Otherwise, assuming we got new data added, we've got two parallel processes running here where we can run those different processes in parallel, just like multiple people might be doing in a manual step. And you'll also notice on each one of our task objects, we can dictate or specify which automate agent is going to run that particular task or execute that task. And that's because with our Automate Plus architecture, we can have or support a multi-execution environment. So we can have multiple agents setting in our environment, agent groups, so we can build some different agent group distribution methodologies and failover capabilities in our environment. I'm going to be running everything on a single agent today. And again, that's for visual purposes. And I can do that because all of but one of our tasks are background processes. So that means they don't need to use any shared resources on the machine. So, keyboard, mouse, an application, or a browser. We only have one of those tasks where we're adding some users to a web application. So everything can run behind the scenes on a single agent in this example, but know that you can spread out that work across multiple machines in a true production environment. So the idea so far behind this workflow, is fairly typical. What you could possibly have here is you have parallel activities that take place, that human beings were performing previously, and what we want to do is utilize automation to take over all of these manual tasks, right? So once we've collected this data, and here's a good step to point out this weight object, our processing of our XLS attachments might be quicker than processing our PDF attachments, but we need all of those files to be processed before we start creating new users in our Active Directory. So we can actually wait for these multiple processes to finish and both of these complete before we move on downstream. So some logic built in there to help us from a timing perspective, which is good. So after we've collected the data, then we're going to create our new users in our authorization environment, which is Active Directory in our example. And then once we have some additional user information, we're then going to add our users to a few different applications that we want our users to be able to work in. We're going to add all of our users to our Automate application. Everyone we hire is going to be Automate developers for us. We're going to add a couple of users to a service desk, and we're going to add some users to just a really makeshift demo web application. So kind of covering the different ways, a couple of different ways we can add users. So be an API call here for our adding users to Automate, a direct database add here for our service desk application, and then we're actually going to see some front of glass or UI automation adding users to our makeshift web application. Then once all their users have been created, again, we're going to wait for all those processes to complete, and then we're going to email our management teams to let them know those users have been added. And I'm going to actually open up a couple of these tasks just so we can kind of see how simple it can be to create these things using Automate. So let's open up our process PDF attachments task here. And, the first thing I want to kind of point out is that as we open up the Automate Task Builder, which is our GUI drag and drop interface where we build out those step level instructions that make up an automated task, is that there is no coding built into this task at all, right? This is all built using our native drag and drop actions. So no C++, no .NET, everything we see built here was using those native actions, which provides us with that no-code, low-code way of building automation. So if we open up one of these particular tasks, like here we're getting a particular OCR region from our PDF, we're supplying it some of that shared data set information we talked about earlier. We're using the OCR engine, which is Tesseract, to actually look for a specified region on that particular document, and we're pulling out that data and storing it into a variable that we created. Multiple different ways we can capture data using OCR, and OCR is really meant for structured data that we know is not going to change. If our PDF sources had, they were well formatted, we could take advantage of another method, maybe using our PDF actions to look for the various fields inside of that PDF document, or scraping the text layer off of that and maybe using regex or another method to get the data that we need to get off the document. So typically there's more than one way to approach automation. We just try to find the path of least resistance, and if it's structured data, then OCR is a great candidate. If it's unstructured data, we have solutions in our toolkit, like our IDP solution. That's great for unstructured data, right? Uses machine learning, artificial intelligence to find out where those fields exist on documents. But if we kind of step through what this task is doing, we created a few variables up front to store our data in. We establish a connection to the database where we created that temp table earlier, and then we loop through any of the attachments that we found for our PDFs, and we're just grabbing the individual regions that contain the user information that we need. And we're removing some white space off of the fields that come in case someone actually put in a extra carriage return or space, right? We're cleaning that stuff up so when we insert that data into our database, we don't have any formatting issues. And then we're writing some things out to a local file. So we're doing some auditing as we go, and then we're ending and closing up that SQL connection once we've completed our particular task. And the same thing goes for other types of tasks here. We talked about adding users to our automated application. And again, we're using things like our native Active Directory actions to list all the objects in a particular container. We're grabbing out particular fields. We're storing that into a data set that we create locally. We're doing some regex in this example. We're formatting some email contents. We're inserting things into variables. We're using an API call here to, once we've created some JSON, some of the data that we've collected, we're doing a simple API call into our Automate instance with that file that we create, contains our JSON to create our Automate users. So there's multiple ways that we can interface with different applications. An API doesn't have to be required. We talked about using a UI method as well. So if we look at a task that's using our web application, again, we're creating some variables. We're tapping into that same data set to get the users that need to be added to our web application. We're actually using our Automate recorder in this example to open up our browser, and we're setting some web elements. We're clicking on buttons. We're looping through that list of users so we can interact with multiple applications to take all this disparate data and enter it into those various systems and applications. And then once we have all of our users created, we're doing that same wait function here for all these processes to complete, and then we're going to email our managers with all that corresponding information. So before we kick off this workflow and we execute it, let's take a quick look at some of our systems here, or representative things of our system. So let's take a quick peek at our email inbox. So here we can see our source for this method, right? We have an Office 365 mailbox. We've got multiple emails that I've sent into this account that contain, some user request forms. So we have a couple PDF attachments, and we have 3 different Excel attachments, and that's what we're going to be out getting, then processing to get our user information that we want to create. We're going to be creating our users in our Active Directory environment. So currently we don't have any users in this particular object, but we're going to be creating some of the users in Active Directory. And if we go into our Automate Server Management Console and look at our users panel, currently we have 5 users in there today. We're going to create some new Automate users automatically as well. All right, so again, we talked about we're going to manually kick off this workflow. So I'm going to get our first step in the process here. We're going to create our data set, and from our ribbon area, I'm going to choose Run from here. And then what's going to happen is our first task is going to start. So we're going to start creating our data set. We're going to visually see some things pop up here in a moment as the task is, or the workflow is executing and the individual tasks are being executed. So we'll see some blue pop-ups occur in kind of the lower right hand side of our screen. So that create data set task is now executing, and once it completes, if we had a successful result, then it's going to go on to the next step of our process. So now it's going out to our email inbox. It is looking for any emails that meet that criteria, seeing if there's attachments present. If there are, it's going to save those to a couple of different directories. And now we're using our evaluation method to determine if there were files that needed to be processed. And it looks like we did have, in both cases, files to process. So that's going as normal. So now it's processing the PDFs and processing the Excel files. And we'll see if these finish at the same time or if one completes a little bit sooner than the other. So now those are both working through. It looks like our Excel files completed a little bit quicker than our PDF. So now that wait condition is coming to play here. So it's waiting for our PDF to finish processing. And once those finish, then it's going to satisfy that wait requirement. Now we're getting our users are going to be added into Active Directory. So we've collected the data from our two different source methods. So our PDF and Excel files, we stored those into our data set that we created as part of our data normalization exercise. And now we get our users created in AD. And once that has created or been completed, then we're going to start adding the individual users into the various applications that they need access into. And at a certain point here, we should see our web browser open, and we'll get an example of seeing a quick demonstration of working with our UI interface. And that ding, if you're hearing in the background, is our emails arriving into our inbox. So we're getting our emails processed as the accounts are being created. So here comes our web application being opened. So it's opening up a browser for us. It's going to take some of that user data. It's going to enter it into the first and last name field. It's pressing that submit button. We got the new user added successful message. It's going to loop through the remaining users that need to be added into this interface. So we got a second user being added there. And let's see if we have another one that gets added to our web application. So this would be, saving a repetitive task of opening up a browser, keying in data, pressing the submit button, waiting for that validation message, going to the next user. Automate's taking that repetitive, mundane task and performing it automatically. We've demonstrated that we can do that through multiple different application types. So once that process has been completed, got another email with some additional users being added. And then now we're going to send some additional emails to our management teams with that information. And we had a process in here to do some cleanup work at the end. I disabled that for our demo today so we could go back and take a look at the different environments and kind of see what was created throughout our process. So once that email step has completed, our workflow would be done, and we automated the entire process. Our remove data set did not run again because we had that disabled, as we can see in our output panel there below. So now let's go into our email inbox, take a look at some of the emails that we received. So here we've got our users that were added to our web application. We sent it to our operations team, letting them know that those were the users that we added. We sent a user to our automated administrators. Here's the users that we added into that application. Here's the users that were added into our service desk, and here were the users that were added into Active Directory. So, we're sending email notifications, letting folks know what occurred. If we go into our AD environment, we looked earlier and there were no users in this object. Now we can see that we have all of our users have now been created for us in Active Directory. And then if we go back into our Automate Server Management Console and we refresh our users panel, now we can see all those additional users that we added into Automate. And if we look at our workflow panel, we can see all the folders were created automatically for us, right? Look in the repository, all those folders were created for those users as well. And one other thing I'll point out, we talked about satisfying auditing requirements. Is we can set up logging templates in each of our tasks, and it'll essentially create a folder with the task name. And inside of those tasks, or folders rather, it's going to start collecting auditing information that we can look at. So, here's an example of some self-auditing that we performed where we started the task name, add users to automate. We logged each individual things that are happening along the way with timestamps. So here we successfully connected to our domain controller to get that user information. We obtained user T. Harrison. We created a unique GUID for that user. And the user was successfully created. And we'd even log how long it took for that task to run, right? So that entire task to create those 580 users took around 30 seconds or so to complete, right? And with that, we demonstrated an Automate workflow to automate some of our HR user onboarding processes. Hope that was extremely beneficial to everyone, to see how easily that Automate can make those related type tasks. Unfortunately, it looks like we went past our scheduled time for today, so thanks everyone for hanging in there with us. We won't have time for the live Q&A during the session, but if you did leave a question in the chat, we'll collect those and we'll follow up with you shortly with answers to any questions that you might have had. And I want to thank all of you for joining, and learning a bit more about how Automate can simplify your processes, like your HR automation processes, how simple Automate can make it. Thanks again for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again.